Imagine this. You're a 10-year-old girl, happily arranging your dolls in the courtyard of your family's home in ancient Rome. The morning sun slips through the marble columns while your mother hums softly, her hands moving gracefully across the loom. Nearby, your father is deep in conversation with his clients about business matters. It feels like any other day in 57 BCE, until the sharp call of ceremonial horns shatters the calm. A great figure has entered the neighborhood, the Pontifex Maximus himself, the highest priest in Rome, here to make his sacred choice. You peek out from behind your mother's robes as the priest studies the gathered children. His gaze moves with cold precision, weighing each young face. Then his eyes land on you. In that instant, everything freezes. He lifts his staff, declaring words that change your life forever. This one serves Vesta. Your mother collapses, sobbing uncontrollably. Your father stands stiff, knowing refusal could bring ruin to the entire household. You don't yet understand why everyone is so distraught. To you, it feels like an honor, being chosen for one of the most sacred roles a Roman girl could dream of. But what lies ahead is not a blessing. It is a binding sentence. 30 years of strict devotion, with punishments so severe that many believed even death was kinder. Today, we're stepping into a chapter of history rarely told. The 3 harshest punishments that loomed over Rome's Vestal Virgins. What you're about to hear is almost never mentioned in school, because the truth was far too unsettling for polished textbooks. These weren't simply religious traditions with strict rules. They were carefully crafted systems of control, cloaked in ritual and divine authority. To be chosen as a Vestal Virgin wasn't the honor people often imagine. It was more like a state-approved abduction presented as sacred duty. And the standards for selection were chillingly precise. The girl had to be between 6 and 10 years old, both parents alive, fully Roman by birth, and without any physical imperfection. She also had to come from a legally recognized marriage, representing purity and symbolic perfection in the eyes of the priests. But here's the detail most people don't know. Families dreaded this process. When the Pontifex Maximus came searching, households often tried to hide their daughters. Some sent them away to distant relatives, others claimed illnesses, and a few even used subtle tricks to make the child appear unsuitable. The announcement of a selection wasn't greeted with joy, it was met with fear. Once a girl was chosen, everything changed instantly. She was taken from her family the very same day, never allowed to return to her childhood home. Her given name was stripped away, replaced with a title that declared her a servant of the goddess Vesta. From that moment, her independence vanished. She could no longer inherit from her family, she couldn't own property in her own right, and even her letters were monitored before leaving her hands. The House of the Vestals, where these young girls would spend the next 30 years of their lives, was often described by ancient writers as the most beautiful prison in the world. Situated in the Roman Forum right beside the Temple of Vesta, it dazzled with marble halls, manicured gardens, and lavish furnishings. But behind all that grandeur, it was still a cage. Every step, every word, every gesture was closely watched by senior Vestals and priests. Her training began immediately with 3 sacred laws, rules that would define her existence. First, a vow of purity lasting 3 decades, with no chance of marriage or companionship. Second, unquestioning obedience to the Pontifex Maximus and other high religious authorities. And third, the eternal duty of guarding the sacred flame, a fire believed to keep the very heart of Rome alive. These weren't gentle instructions. They were laws enforced by punishments so severe that other Roman penalties seemed merciful in comparison. The girl quickly learned a painful truth. Her body, her future, her very identity no longer belonged to her. They belonged to Rome. And Rome had very clear ideas about what happened when a Vestal failed. Outwardly, she was told she was chosen, sacred, and elevated above all other women in the empire. Yet that same sacred status made her punishments unimaginably harsh. Because she was considered holy, she couldn't be treated like an ordinary criminal. Instead, Rome devised punishments that outwardly preserved her sanctity while inwardly breaking her spirit. Ancient accounts even describe new initiates weeping for months after their selection, begging to return to their families, sometimes refusing to eat until they were forced. The older Vestals would silence them with a single, cold reminder. Resistance was useless. The goddess had chosen them, and their suffering was not just expected. It was their sacred duty. The unspoken message behind all the rules was clear and chilling. You belong to us now, forever. The psychological conditioning was relentless. From the very beginning, the girl was taught that her entire worth depended on perfect obedience as a Vestal. One slip, one moment of weakness, even a hint of doubt, could bring punishment so severe that she might pray for an end. Yet death was not an option. She was too sacred to execute and far too valuable to release. This sacred status became the basis for punishments so inventive in their cruelty that modern scholars often study them as some of the earliest forms of institutionalized psychological control. Rome had mastered the art of breaking a spirit while keeping the body alive, forced to endure. And if you think being chosen was the darkest part of the tale, the real nightmare began when a Vestal made her first mistake. The most dreaded responsibility was tending to the eternal flame inside the Temple of Vesta, a fire that symbolized Rome's divine protection and eternal strength. Should that flame ever die out, it wasn't just a religious failure. It was branded as treason against the state itself. When the sacred fire went dark, panic set in. An investigation began instantly. The Pontifex Maximus would summon each Vestal, questioning them one by one. Every word, every glance was examined for signs of negligence, distraction, or even hidden moral weakness. These interrogations could stretch on for days. The suspect was often kept in isolation, locked in a windowless chamber deep beneath the temple, deprived of rest and food until some kind of confession was wrung out. But that was only the beginning. The punishment awaiting her had a name, the verberatio, and it was carried out in absolute darkness, in the hidden depths of the temple complex. The punishment known as the verberatio was shrouded in secrecy and fear. The condemned Vestal would be bound to a wooden frame created specifically for this ritual. And in a chilling display of authority, it was the Pontifex Maximus himself who carried out the sentence, using rods consecrated in the name of Vesta. This wasn't random cruelty. It was staged as a ritual, designed to cause immense suffering while preserving the woman's sacred status. Because her voice was considered holy, she wasn't allowed to cry out. A leather gag muffled any sound. Because her blood was deemed consecrated, the rods were crafted to leave deep internal damage without breaking the skin. Ancient sources even describe Vestals who died days later from the hidden injuries of this punishment. Yet officially, the cause of death was never listed as punishment. It was recorded as sudden illness or worse, as divine judgment. To the wider Roman public, these beatings were invisible, hidden beneath layers of ritual secrecy. But the physical pain was only half the weapon. The constant psychological warfare was just as devastating. A Vestal could never be sure when the next inspection of the sacred flame would take place. She lived in a state of permanent dread, fearing that a draft, a careless moment, or even bad luck could cause the fire to die. This relentless anxiety consumed many of them. Ancient accounts speak of Vestals who trembled uncontrollably, whose hair fell out from stress, and who seemed to age years in only a few months after enduring their first verberatio. The punishment wasn't only about bruising the body, it was about breaking the spirit, stripping away the last sense of safety and replacing it with obedience. And perhaps the cruelest part? The sacred flame could go out for reasons completely beyond a Vestal's control. Even nature itself could condemn her. The sacred flame could be extinguished by anything: a sudden gust of wind, a flaw in the temple's structure, or even sabotage from Rome's enemies. But no matter the cause, the blame always landed on the Vestals. And punishment was always certain. Some ancient writers even suggest that the flame was sometimes deliberately allowed to go out, giving authorities an excuse to target a particular Vestal. Political grudges or personal vendettas could be disguised as divine justice, making the priesthood's cruelty look like religious duty. And the aftermath was calculated for maximum effect. The injured Vestal was placed under the care of temple physicians, but with strict instructions to provide only the bare minimum. Her recovery was slow, her pain deliberately prolonged, Every day she was reminded that her suffering was her fault, that she had failed the goddess, and that only flawless service from now on could save her from further punishment. The result was devastating. Survivors of the Verberatio were broken down into obedience, too afraid to show the slightest independence or spark of individuality. They became hollow, carrying out their rituals with robotic precision while their inner lives withered away. But as cruel as these beatings were, they weren't Rome's most terrifying invention. The gravest accusation a Vestal could face was called incestum, a word that meant pollution or defilement. In practice, it meant being suspected of breaking her vow of purity. And the punishment for incestum wasn't execution. It was something far worse. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the year 216 BCE, with the cases of Opmia and Floronia. According to the historian Livy, both women were accused of violating their vows based on nothing more than gossip and political rivalry. Their so-called trial was carried out in secret by the College of Pontiffs. There was no defense, no real evidence, just whispers and accusations from unnamed sources, enough to seal their fate. When the sentence was delivered, the Vestal was told she would be returned to the earth, the source of all life. It sounded poetic, almost gentle. But behind those words lay a punishment so chilling that it was beyond ordinary imagination. The ritual always began at dawn. A solemn procession wound its way through the Roman Forum, and at its center walked the condemned Vestal. She wore a white gown like a bride, her hair carefully styled, flowers woven into her veil. To anyone unaware of the truth, the scene could have looked like a wedding march. And in a way it was. Only the ceremony was not about love. It was a marriage to death itself. The procession moved slowly through Rome, a public reminder of what happened to those who violated sacred vows. Yet the Vestal was given no voice. She could not plead. She could not cry. She could not even whisper. Wax sealed her lips, silencing any final words that might stir compassion in the crowd. The journey ended at a place called the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked, just beyond the city walls. There, workers had prepared her final chamber. Carved deep into the earth, it could only be reached by a narrow staircase that would be sealed forever once she entered. Inside that underground room, Rome revealed what it called mercy. A bed was placed for her, along with a flickering lamp, a jug of water, a piece of bread, and a cup of milk. Officials insisted this was not an execution. Rome, they said, merely left her alone in the earth, leaving the gods to decide her fate. The small rations placed in the chamber were Rome's excuse. By leaving food and water, officials claimed they weren't committing murder. It was a legal fiction, cruel and calculated. The provisions were measured with cold precision. A lamp with oil that would burn for only a few hours. A jug of water, a piece of bread, a little milk, barely enough to last 2 or 3 days. But in truth, the air inside that sealed chamber would run out long before the food was gone. Even the descent into the chamber was carefully staged. The Vestal had to walk down the steps herself. No one could carry her and no one could push her. If they did, the city would be guilty of her death. Rome required her to take each step, to participate in her own burial. Once she reached the bottom, the workers acted quickly. The staircase was dismantled, the entrance filled with dirt and stone, packed so tightly that not even a whisper could escape. When they were finished, the ground looked untouched. Only a plain stone, without name or inscription, hinted at what lay beneath. Within hours, all traces of the ceremony had vanished. Yet ancient writers left behind chillingly precise descriptions of what followed. In the flickering light of the lamp, the Vestal would have a few hours to take in her surroundings. She could see the bread, the water, the milk, reminders that her end would not come swiftly. She could feel the air grow heavy, each breath harder than the last. Some accounts speak of eerie sounds rising from the ground in the days that followed. Workers claimed to hear scratching beneath the earth, fingernails against stone, wood shifting against soil, as if the buried Vestal had fought to claw her way back into the light. Perhaps the most haunting part of this ritual was not the burial itself, but the silence that followed. The condemned Vestal's name was erased from every public record. Her family was forbidden to grieve, forbidden even to speak her name. She wasn't simply put to death. She was erased, as though she had never lived at all. The erasure was so thorough that modern historians still struggle to identify who these women were. Their names were systematically stripped from documents, leaving only faint shadows in the historical record. We know the practice took place for centuries, yet the victims remain nameless, lost to memory. The official reasoning behind it never changed. Because the Vestal had walked into the chamber on her own, because she was given food and water, and because no Roman hand directly struck her down, the city could say this was not an execution. Instead, it was presented as divine judgment, carried out by fate itself. Now, on the surface, Vestals who completed their 30 years of service faced a very different destiny. They were celebrated with ceremonies, granted financial rewards from the state, and officially allowed to marry and start families. To outsiders, it looked like a well-earned reward for decades of devotion. But the reality told another story. Let's look at the math. A girl chosen at the age of 8 would complete her service at 38. In Rome, most women had married and raised children long before reaching that age. A woman in her late 30s was often considered past her prime for marriage. The freedom to wed was little more than an empty promise, because in practice, very few men wanted to marry a former Vestal. And beyond the question of marriage, the social barriers were even harsher than the biological ones. Romans believed that women who had served 3 decades as Vestals were no longer ordinary. Years spent in sacred duty were thought to leave them permanently marked by divine forces, making them unfit for the life of a wife or mother. Many men feared that marrying a former Vestal might bring punishment from the gods. Others believed that her long years of celibacy had somehow made her incapable of fulfilling the role expected of Roman women. The story of Claudia Quinta reveals just how cruel this belief could be. After finishing her service in 43 CE, she was given a generous dowry and introduced to several respectable suitors. Yet every engagement collapsed. Each time, the families consulted religious authorities, who warned that marrying a former Vestal would taint their lineage and offend the divine. Claudia spent the next 20 years in solitude, living in a small house outside Rome. Despite her devotion to the state, society rejected her. She never married, had no children, and when she died, her funeral was attended only by hired mourners. Her grave, like so many others, was left unmarked. Even the promised rewards often failed to provide security. Pensions were reduced or denied outright, lost to endless bureaucracy and shifting laws. Many women left temple life not only socially isolated but financially ruined, with no family to rely on and no practical skills to survive independently. And then there was the unseen cost, the psychological toll of 30 years spent under relentless discipline. What modern medicine might call deep trauma left scars that never faded. Accounts tell of former Vestals plagued by panic attacks, by fears that the sacred flame had gone out, by compulsively checking their doors at night. Some could not bear to be touched, their emotions locked away after decades of forced restraint. For many, freedom itself became terrifying. A few ended their lives, unable to face the outside world. Others withdrew completely, shutting themselves inside small homes where they lived in silence. Ghosts of the temple, shadows of the women they might have been. Some former Vestals tried to rejoin society, but after decades of rigid ritual, even basic social interactions felt impossible. The most heartbreaking cases were those who slipped into what historians later called sacred madness. These women wandered the streets of Rome, claiming visions from the goddess Vesta. They preached about divine revelations, performed strange public rituals, and drew curious crowds. Authorities rarely intervened. Instead, they dismissed these women as harmless eccentrics, never acknowledging the deep scars of institutional trauma that had led them there. Perhaps the cruelest twist of all was when some were drawn back into the very system that had broken them. They were placed as advisors or supervisors, forced to train the next generation. Having endured years of hardship, they now became instruments of the same suffering, passing on a cycle of control that ensured the institution survived for centuries. The so-called freedom offered after 30 years of service revealed itself as the greatest deception. These women gave up their youth, their chance at family, their independence, and often their peace of mind. In return, Rome left them with social exile, financial insecurity, and lasting psychological wounds. The treatment of the Vestal Virgins shows how refined and how hidden Roman cruelty could be when cloaked in the language of religion. These women were not simply victims of a few corrupt priests or cruel officials. They were casualties of a system carefully designed to regulate female autonomy through fear and ritual. Modern psychological studies of ancient accounts suggest that the Vestal institution functioned like a long experiment in control. Girls were taken at their most vulnerable age, cut off from normal development, and conditioned through alternating punishments and rewards. Over time, this created women who depended entirely on institutional approval to exist. The punishments they faced formed a chilling ladder of despair. Ritual beatings stripped away their physical safety. Living burial erased even the possibility of freedom. And finally, the false promise of liberation revealed the harshest truth of all, that even perfect obedience led only to abandonment and silence. What makes this system especially chilling is how completely it became normalized in Roman life. Citizens who might have been horrified to see male slaves treated this way accepted the suffering of Vestal Virgins as necessary for preserving divine favor and social order. Religion gave the cruelty a disguise. Wrapped in sacred language, it became invisible, not only to ordinary Romans, but to many historians who later repeated the official justifications without question. And the echoes of this system reach far beyond ancient Rome. The use of purity as a weapon of control, the embedding of harsh punishment within religious tradition, and the manipulation of victims into accepting their own oppression, these patterns have resurfaced in different forms throughout history, and in some ways still exist today. The women caught in this system should not be remembered as symbols of Roman piety. They were human beings who endured immense suffering in service to a state that valued obedience more than humanity. Their erased stories remind us of a sobering truth. The most dangerous tyrannies are often those that hide behind sacred justifications, claiming divine authority to excuse human cruelty. These women lived, suffered, and died, not as myths, not as legends, but as people. In remembering them, we do more than honor their courage. We acknowledge our responsibility to recognize and resist systems of cruelty wherever and whenever they appear.